and welcome inside the School of Communications at Quinnipiac University. I am Assistant Professor of Journalism Nick Pietruszkiewicz. Joining us today for the first episode of What's Your Story is NBC Sports and Golf Channel's Jimmy Roberts. Thanks for joining us, Jimmy.
You did that, thank you. Nick, you did that intro like a true TV pro.
Maybe I missed my calling, I'm
Maybe.
not sure.
Maybe.
So I believe it's 15 Emmys, correct?
Yep.
If the students, we're surrounded by some of the students in my Journalism 380 class and some other students here in the School of Communications. If they wanted to visit one of your Emmys, is one on display anywhere?
I don't know where you would have gotten that information. So the one used to be in my mother's house, but that's no longer the case. But the one that seems to get the most attention is the one that's over the bar in a place that I worked in college, which you know something about, R.J. Bentley's filling station in College Park. And I was one of the original employees there. When they opened the bar, the way it worked was they ended up getting a lot of the local College Park athletes, the University of Maryland athletes, to donate their jerseys. And I said to the guy who owned the bar, I said, you know, I'll give you my high school lacrosse jersey, but beyond that, I don't think you'd want that. He said, well, why don't you give me one of those Emmys? And I think he was just surprised when I showed up one day with the Emmy, and it's sat over the bar for a long time now. Most people don't even know what it is. He says people think it's an egg beater.
So, Jimmy, like me, we went to the University of Maryland. What was the moment you decided, this is what I want to do, I want to be a journalist?
Well, so when I was in school, I studied a curriculum that's probably a lot like what you guys are studying. I had written for a newspaper when I was in high school, a Gannett newspaper, and I went to school not knowing exactly what I wanted to do, but thinking I wanted to be involved in sports somehow and in communications because it just seemed like fun. So I went to Maryland. I had originally gone to Maryland thinking that I was going to play lacrosse and gotten a couple of letters from them, and was cut from the team. And what I ended up doing was then broadcasting the Maryland lacrosse team on the radio. And it just so happened that that year, the championship game, which Maryland played in again, they were defending national champions, which Maryland played in, was on a show called Wide World of Sports. Let me see a show of hands in this room. How many people in this room have heard of Wide World of Sports? Okay, you don't count back there. Okay, so there was a time when Wide World of Sports was as big, probably a bigger deal than SportsCenter was or is, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that back then there were so far fewer choices to watch sports on television. It was on every Saturday from 4:30 to 6, and it included everything from, well, everything you can imagine. And one of those things that year was the first broadcast, national broadcast of a lacrosse game. And it was Maryland versus Cornell. And because I was broadcasting the games on the radio, I had an idea that maybe I'd call up the producers at Wide World of Sports and see if they could, you know, use some help, because back then, again, lacrosse was such an obscure sport. Not too many people really knew about it, or presumably. And I'll never forget what the producer, whose name was Ned Steckel, said to me after about the 10th phone call. He said, just leave me alone and call my production assistant, which I did, a guy named John Coulter. And I didn't realize that there was a program back then which existed for many years. It probably still does it. I know it does at CBS, and I think we have it at NBC too, where young people could come and work as what we called occasional labor. We were runners, we were gophers. And it would just give us an opportunity, not being paid a lot of money, to kind of be around and help them out. And it was getting people at the airport, and it was running to get food at McDonald's and making copies. And if you'd been around long enough, they gave you the responsibility of doing things that were more central to the telecast. You'd be a graphics assistant. You'd be on the sidelines, you know, working with the sideline cameraman or reporter. Anyway, so I did that for that lacrosse game, and it was the first opportunity that I had to work in television. It was just a lot of fun. And I did that all throughout college. And when I graduated, I was waiting tables at Bentley's and didn't know what else I could do, so I ended up calling up the only production assistant who was left there. It was a guy named Sean McManus. And the reason Nick is laughing is because Sean McManus went on to become the CEO of CBS Sports, and he's now retiring this year. But he was also the son of Jim McKay, who was a legendary broadcaster. But Sean hired me, and I just worked as a runner for a few months, then got hired as a production assistant. And I worked at ABC in news and sports for 8 years. And I made the transition to be in front of the camera. I worked in news and sports. I started as a production assistant, then became an associate producer. Then I went to work for the news division as a writer and producer. Then came back to sports. But the only reason I ended up moving in front of the camera was because they were going to eliminate my job, and I wasn't really sure what I was qualified to do or what I could do. So at the time, I had worked on a show called Sports Beat at ABC, and that was a show that was hosted by a man named Howard Cosell, who some of you may have heard of. Again, let me see, show of hands. Howard Cosell? Okay, so this is a name that every single one of you needs to write down and go search it, okay? Because here's the fact. Howard Cosell was, without question, the biggest star that television sports has ever produced. I won't go any further because I'd be here forever. But it just so happened that one of the men who was producing his show had worked at this new startup in central Connecticut called ESPN. And so they were looking for people that might be able to do a number of things, write and produce. That's where I met Dave Miller and worked with Dave. But it was a vastly different place back then. It was as cable could be, and cable as an adjective, not a noun. It was, save every penny, second-class citizens, scratching and clawing for every piece of ground that we could get. And I was just fortunate enough that I was there at a time when I was there from 1988 to 2000, when ESPN kind of exploded and went from being something that was, a real kind of niche piece of programming to very, very mainstream. And I think that probably my greatest distinction as a professional would be that when I left ESPN to go to NBC, the person that they hired to fill my head count was a guy named Scott Van Pelt. So you guys all know who he is, of course. And he and I joke all the time. Another Terrapin, yeah. And he and I joke all the time that I think he did okay. But anyway, I kind of fell into it. So long story short, which is what I have a tendency to do. I have a tendency to make short stories long. And that's what I did here. I kind of just fell into it.
Do you ever think about how different your life would be without the persistence of driving that person crazy with the 10 phone calls, or knowing another person and networking to make another phone call later to get that first job?
Yeah, I mean, we're all a product of good fortune and hard work. There's no substitute for hard work. I don't have the exclusive rights on that piece of wisdom. There is no substitute for hard work. And I was just in the right place at the right time. I knew somebody who knew somebody, and they were willing to give me an opportunity. And I went someplace and I was out of my comfort zone. And I say it all the time. If there was such a thing as YouTube in 1988, I'd be waiting tables right now. Because somewhere in the bowels of ESPN are some tapes that would make you think that I have no business being a broadcaster and never would. So to your point about persistence and kind of getting out of your comfort zone and trying to learn, work hard. It's funny, I remember I was sent down to the University of Maryland, must have been about my first year or so, and I didn't have any experience on camera, so I was kind of learning on the fly. And I remember I did a feature for SportsCenter, and it was on the kicker for the University of Maryland, a guy named Jess Atkinson. And I did a stand-up bridge in the middle of the piece, and the bridge couldn't have been any longer than 15 seconds. It took me 23 takes to do a 15-second stand-up. So we all get better if you work hard, I think, and really pay attention to what you're doing.
Did you ever have to fight the urge to say, maybe this isn't for me? I mean, they're probably all going through this at times, like, this isn't coming out the way I want it to. Maybe this isn't for me. But then to fight through that and come out the other side, like, did you have to do that?
Yeah, I don't know that I was smart enough, you know, and I was also pretty stubborn. And my big break, I think, I had two pretty big breaks in my life, professionally. One was that one of the things I noticed, I was the first full-time bureau reporter at ESPN. They hired me, and then they hired Andrea Kramer to be in Chicago. I was in New York. They hired Andrea Kramer, and then they hired Chris Myers to be in Los Angeles. And now, of course, there are a million bureau reporters out there. And I'd occasionally come in and do some studio shows, which were occasionally disastrous, and I got better at that too. But my big break was that I looked around and I noticed that in order to get ahead there, it seemed like a lot of people had beats, you know, like there was their regular beat. So Carl Ravitch did baseball. And of course, you know, there were a couple, Andrea did football. But I recognized that probably a good thing to do would be to get a beat. And I had some experience from my days at ABC in production from being involved with the golf broadcast. So I said to them, why don't we do golf? Let's cover some golf. Now this is the late 1980s, early 1990s. And so reluctantly, Steve Anderson, who was running SportsCenter at the time, said, okay, we'll do that. They weren't really committed to it. And I did that for a few years, and then Tiger Woods happened. And then, you know, of course we need a beat reporter. And, you know, I had the good fortune of the fact that Tiger was a sports geek. And all he did, he watched a bunch of SportsCenter. So he knew me. And after the 97 Masters, which was that historic, you know, his first major championship, I was the only interview he did. And it's not because he was a Jimmy Roberts fan, it's because he was a SportsCenter fan. So for Tiger Woods, he was more than happy to tell the President of the United States that he wasn't going to Jackie Robinson's celebration at Shea Stadium with Rachel Robinson, Jackie's widow, but he sure was going to hang around to do an interview for SportsCenter. So that was really the big break for me.
I watched that interview earlier this week, and the attention to detail in the words that you chose with each question stood out to me. Can you walk us through the process of how you prepare for an interview?
I will, but let me just fill in one blank. So, because in journalism, here's something you should know, and I'm sure Nick would say this: do not ever, ever talk about this being the second best or the second most or the second anything without telling the people that you're talking to or writing for what the first is, okay? So the other, real quickly, great opportunity that I had was, it's a little complicated, I will get to that,
okay.
But just let me say, because this was just an enormous break for me. So this is in 92. An Olympic year, and I was covering also Olympic sports and figure skating. So it was at the same year that ABC got a playoff game, and here's the cast of characters that was involved in covering figure skating at the time. It was Al Michaels was doing the play-by-play, and then Peggy Fleming was doing the expert commentary, and a woman named Julie Moran was the rinkside reporter. We got a NFL playoff game that weekend, so Al no longer could do that. So they moved Julie Moran into the commentary booth to do the play-by-play with Peggy, and they needed a rinkside reporter. Well, I was working at ESPN, which was owned by ABC, it still is, and kind of made sense that they'd give the opportunity. They'd fill that blank by coming to somebody like me. great fortune for me. And it just so happened that the executive producer of ABC Sports at the time was a guy who was a production assistant with me years earlier. But anyway, I got the job, and as you may or may not remember, that was the Nancy Kerrigan, Tanya Harding national championships. And it became just the biggest news. You just cannot even imagine how big a deal that became. And it became my story, because I was the only one there who was qualified to be a reporter.
Yep.
And so that week, I got a lot of airtime that week. And as a result, a man named Dick Ebersol, who was running NBC Sports at the time, he took notice of me. And then once the whole thing happened with Tiger, I was on his radar, and I got hired at NBC. So those were my two gigantic breaks. In terms of interviews and how you prepare, how I can only say what I do. I have had a pretty rocky relationship with Tiger over the years, and that's because it was always my feeling that when you interview somebody, your obligation is not to that person, it's to the people who are watching. One of the best quotes that I ever heard from a journalist came from a guy named Tom Callahan, writer for the Washington, I guess he wrote for the Post, he wrote for Newsweek. Anyway, he wrote a lot of NBA, and he was doing a story on Larry Bird. And he went to practice, and Bird, for those of you who don't know, wasn't the easiest guy to get along with. He was a little prickly. And Callahan was there, and he said, finally Bird says to him, what do you want? What are you doing? What's the story going to be about? And he said, fair to you, true to me. And I think that's the greatest single characterization of what the responsibility of a reporter, of what a journalist is. Fair to the people that you're interviewing, but true to the ideals of your own integrity. That's gotten me in trouble over the years, because network television is a partnership often, where it's not always a journalistic endeavor. And so frequently it's about making sure that you don't create any choppy waters. I created some choppy waters over the years with Tiger, certainly not in that interview, although if you watched it, you'll remember that I was talking to him and I said something and he kind of snapped back at me and he said, wait, I'll get to that in a minute. I had a great relationship with Tiger. We're okay now, but there were many, many years. He once walked out on me in the middle of a live interview. But I do think there are three things, and I tell my oldest son is a sports broadcaster. He's the sports director of the NBC affiliate in Rochester, New York. And you know, if my kids were here, they would all tell you the same thing that I beat them over the head with. Work hard, be organized, and be prepared. You know, I really honestly believe, it's just my opinion, but if you do that, you know, you're going to be in a good position. I think it's important to make sure, you know, I talked about Howard Cosell before. So Howard Cosell, again, was as big a celebrity as this industry has ever produced, by a factor of 100. I mean, think Stephen A. Smith, but a bigger deal than Stephen A. Smith. I think that's really fair. You think that's fair to say? You?
Yeah, I agree.
So you got to go look this guy up and find the clips too, because
The voice.
He was just crazy. People often ask me what I learned from Howard, and here's the single best takeaway from Howard. Howard was able to do interviews with people, the biggest celebrities there were, heads of state, you know, the biggest, Muhammad Ali. There were a lot of people who feel like he and Muhammad had a symbiotic relationship where they kind of made each other. Howard would tell you that he probably made Muhammad, but Howard's biggest talent in my mind was that he was able to ask difficult questions and not lose the people that he was interviewing. And that is a really, really tough thing to do.
So that's one of the things I want to go back very briefly on, is you mentioned
you don't have to do the specific example of Tiger if you don't want, but Tiger walking out on you in a live interview.
I'm comfortable with
you
it. I can
knew
feel
the
good.
question you had to ask was probably not one that maybe he wanted to hear. How do you approach the question that you know you have to ask, but it's going to piss him off?
I think you just, there are a lot of ways to ask, I think. He walked out on me because he was angry at something that he had perceived, a slight that he had perceived I was responsible for weeks before. He wasn't paying attention and he was wrong. But I think that, there are ways to do it, and there are cheap ways, such as, it's been said, that your jump shot isn't very good, or it's been said that you need to work on your jump shot. How would you answer that criticism? You could say it that way, or you could say something like, you're shooting 19% from 12 feet and beyond. Yep. What do you have to do to get better? Yep. You just have to think about the way you want to do things. I think, again, I get back to the Callahan quote, fair to you, true to me. I try and treat people the way I would want to be treated. But at the end of the day, when it comes to doing this job, you got to be able to look yourself in the mirror. Yep. I give you a perfect example of something that made me want to throw a brick at the TV. So this year, I think it was a Big Ten game. So Ryan Day, the coach of Ohio State, came off the field, and there's a mandated coach's interview at halftime. One team does it on the way to the locker room, the other team does it, the other coach does it on the way back from the locker room, and they usually take the on the way to the locker room interview live. This sideline reporter asks Ryan Day something, and his response is immediately to kind of not really answer the question and jump into, yeah, I'll tell you what though, what happened out there in the first half, that wasn't right, and I'm going to want to talk to somebody about that. That was wrong what happened out there in the first half, and he was hot. The sideline reporter's next question is, let's talk about the offensive line.
No.
Let me just see somebody tell me what the next question should have been. Anybody? Nick, what was the next question supposed to be?
To follow up on the answer to the first question.
What happened out there in the first half that you're so angry about? If you were having that discussion with somebody in a bar, in a classroom, anywhere, isn't that what you would want to do? Yep. Use your curiosity. That's what I would say.
And there's a possibility that, and we talk about it a lot in class, and we talk about how we get from a blank screen to the finished product and all the steps in between. One of them is probably listening, because they might not have actually heard the answer, right, because they were concerned. And I'm not going to speak poorly of the person that asked the question, but there is a strong possibility, correct, that they might not have even heard the answer?
I'm not giving that person that benefit of the doubt. That was just...
I tried.
That was just bad.
So what skill is the most important to doing this job and doing it well?
Well, there's lots of skills that are critical. So if you're going to be a presenter, if you're going to be somebody, I do a lot of studio work now. When I first got the job, I always characterize this the same way. When I first got the job, I was terrible. I was awful. And I always insert this second clause in the sentence, and there are some people who still think that I am. But one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got, just purely performative, however slowly you're speaking, you're not speaking as slowly as you think you're speaking. So what happens? You're anxious, you're a little nervous about whatever, whether it's your facts or the person sitting next to you or whatever. So what happens? your adrenaline starts to course through your system. Your heartbeat starts to pick up. You start to speak more quickly than you might have intended to. And that's just a recipe for disaster, because all that's going to happen is that your brain, your lips will not be able to keep up with your brain. You'll start stumbling. Then you'll become aware of the fact that you're not presenting yourself in the way that you want to. It's just an absolute recipe for disaster. So if we're talking about just pure presentation, slow down. If you have an opportunity, just take out your phones and do this. Record yourself doing 30 seconds of something, and just be mindful of the fact that you want to speak a little bit more slowly than you ordinarily would. Record yourself, then watch it. I bet that you can't tell the difference. You wouldn't look at that and say, oh man, why was I speaking so slowly? No, it would seem normal. So just remember, if it's about performance, speak slowly.
The last question I have, and then we're going to open it up to all of the students sitting here, is I don't think it would be fair to bury our heads in the sand and say and ignore the fact that journalism has had some hard days recently.
Truth.
Both in the production of the product itself and the business. Why is this still such a worthwhile profession?
Because it's fun. You'd rather be in back of a desk?
No, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. You get to be involved. Look, it's a cliche, but if you love your job, you've probably heard this, if you love your job, you won't work a day in your life. And it changes every day. To me, it's interesting most days. I really still think it's a wonderful thing to be involved with, but you just need to ask yourself, what's a journalist? What is a journalist? A journalist isn't somebody who holds a microphone or writes something down in a pad. I personally believe, and this is just me, and I think it's open to interpretation, and you probably learn in these classrooms a lot about what the definition of it is. A journalism is storytelling. Journalism is seeking truth. So, if that's what you're after, if you can square with yourself that what you're doing is looking for the truth or trying to tell a story, I think that's real journalism. I think that there's a lot these days that doesn't kind of meet that level. And here's why. So many of these organizations, broadcast organizations, NBC, Golf Channel, ESPN, they're in partnership with the people that they're covering. Well, how in the world can you really get to the bottom of an ugly story if there is an ugly story? How can you get to the bottom of an ugly story if it's going to reflect unfavorably on your business partner? I know that was sticky at ESPN, at the highest levels. I would say it's the dirty little secret, but it's not such a little secret anymore. And that's why personal integrity is the most important thing. At the end of the day, you got to go home, you got to look at yourself in the mirror and decide, am I okay with the way this all went? What could I have done differently? Not even what could I have done differently, how can I make it better? And I think that in anything you do, that's a worthwhile exercise. At the end of the day, looking at yourself and saying, how can I be better? Because you know something? People like Wayne Gretzky and Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods and Rafa Nadal, Novak Djokovic, they all do the same thing for what they do. As good as they are and have been, we've seen it, a million times that Tiger was the last one on the range. Roger Federer's out there hitting balls till his arm feels like it's going to drop off. Same with, Serena Williams or whomever it is. The best aspire to be better. And I think that's kind of worthwhile for all of us to adopt, going forward.
We've reached the limit of you having to listen to me, so I'm going to
all my
hand it
BS.
over to the students. So who's got questions? James.
So what was the story in your career that you struggled with the most, and how did you end up getting around the struggles in publishing the story?
Okay, so first, going forward, everybody just tell me your name before you start and where you're from, okay? So what's your name?
James.
And you're from?
Long Island.
Okay, where?
Nassau County, North Shore.
Okay. All right, so the story that I struggled with the most. I'm not sure, but I can tell you the most complex story that I was ever involved with. So about 10 years ago, I had a show on Golf Channel called In Play. And the very first story we did was a story about a guy named Valentino Dixon. Anybody know that name? Okay, so Valentino Dixon was a guy who was obsessed with golf. He was a very talented artist, spent 10 hours every day sketching scenes of golf. He's completely obsessed with the game. The strange thing about Valentino was, though, he had never been on a golf course. He'd never held a golf club. Valentino Dixon was serving a life sentence in Attica prison for murder. How do we get to the point where golf is his salvation? So there used to be a feature in Golf Digest magazine called How Golf Saved My Life. And Valentino wrote a letter to the editor, a guy named Max Adler, talking about how he was serving this prison sentence in Attica, and the warden came by one day. He saw that he was a talented artist. He used to sketch scenes of a million other things. And he said, I wonder if you could sketch me this. It's a picture of the 12th hole at Augusta National. And Valentino said, what's Augusta? I never heard of it. But he gave him the picture, and he sketched it, and what he found was that golf scenes made him feel a measure of peace and tranquility. So he did everything he could to get more and more pictures of golf, and he spent all this time obsessing on golf. Turns out Valentino also claimed that he was innocent. He was innocent. And we went to Attica and spent a bunch of time with him and did a big investigation on the details of his claims. And along with the efforts of Golf Digest and the Innocence Project and some students at Georgetown, Valentino's conviction was vacated a few years ago. And his story is remarkable, but it was such a complex story with so many nuances. And I mean, I found myself, one of the parts of it was, you talk about asking a difficult question. You know, here I am in Attica interviewing Valentino and asking him about what happened. And he said, we're talking about the incident for which he was arrested. And I said, so you're innocent? Are you telling me you're innocent? And he said, yes. And I said, why should anybody believe you? Now, sitting across from a convicted murderer in a maximum security prison, asking a question like that wasn't something that I had a lot of experience with. And then as it happened, the guy who was in fact guilty of the murder was serving in the same cell block for another crime, and we interviewed him. And again, a lot more difficult questions. And more difficult questions to the district attorney about what seemed to be a terribly, terribly unfair prosecution that didn't seem to be in pursuit of the truth or justice. It seemed to be in pursuit of a conviction. I think I'm proudest of that work because we did the right thing, and it was hard and it was complicated. And there was a lot of soul searching involved in terms of what was fair game and what wasn't. But in the end, this guy got out of prison. We helped. I think we told the story fairly and truthfully. It took a long time to kind of figure out the roadmap and what was the right way to tell that story.
Who's next?
So, hi, I'm Brianna. I'm from Massachusetts.
Okay.
So, when you have kind of those more tougher, complicated stories, and maybe things aren't going your way, how do you know when it's time to pivot, maybe go in another direction, or you just keep on going and pushing?
That is such a good question. That is really, Brianna, that's a terrific question. Because it's a dance you do. And if we're just talking about interviewing, okay? You know, it's an interpersonal connection. And going back to the co-sell thing, it's about not losing the person. You know, you can hammer away, and listen, there are plenty of examples of people in our industry who, they're like bulldogs, they're terriers, they're in there, they're asking away, and at some point they're gonna lose the person they're talking to. You gotta figure out how to do the dance and how to get to where you wanna go. So, I think it's instinct, and it's, you know, there's a voice, I think, inside all of us. Like, you don't need your mother to tell you that you did something wrong, right? You probably know. You might not want to admit it. That's the way I always felt. And I think there's a voice inside you that tells you, uh-oh, you know, time to pivot. You know, and you got to figure out whatever your strategy is. That's in terms of the interview. In terms of telling the story, a lot of sleepless nights, you know, a lot of long nights, a lot of trying to figure it out, get it right. Get it right. You know, again, fair to you, true to me. It has a lot of applications.
Colin?
I'm Colin from Massachusetts. When covering a certain sport or an athlete, how do you differentiate being a fan to knowing you have a job to do?
That's another good question. I'm in the industry because I am a fan. And I think when I was younger, I was more subject to kind of that part of my inner being, if not taking over, influencing me. I think it's just about, you gotta remind yourself why you're there. And it doesn't mean that everybody is there to do a job like it's 60 minutes. You know, but again, you got to be able to look at yourself in the mirror. It's about, do you feel good with that question? Do you feel good with, you know, the way you approached it? And you'll know. You know, you'll know. But again, you need to kind of find the middle ground between not losing the person and asking the right questions. It's a balance, and that's what a career is all about. It's getting better, learning from your mistakes and your missteps. How can I be better tomorrow? And I really think that applies everywhere. But, you know, there's lots of things that I've done. I mean, I'd have to think about them, but there's lots of interviews that I've done or interactions that I've had that I know I could have done better with. Hopefully I learned from them, you know. I think that it's really important to learn. There were a lot of years I would not watch myself on television. Never. But it became a necessary evil to try and get better. Here's one thing I learned. You'll get a kick out of this. My wife asked me this last night. When I first started working at ESPN, one of the things that I noticed was that what I was saying was obviously important, but the perception of people watching also influenced my credibility. And if they thought that I was uncomfortable, you know, I think that they were going to take me less seriously. One of the things that I noticed was when I was doing a stand-up bridge like that one that I did for 23 takes, was that I looked uncomfortable with my hands when I'm doing a stand-up. And you may notice it if any of you do this or you watch people on television. When that person's doing a stand-up bridge or is, you know, talking to camera, a lot of times people don't know what to do with their hands. I didn't know what to do with my hands. So you know what I did? I asked the photographer, I need a medium shot. All my stand-ups needed to be medium shots so that you never saw my hands and I could just stick them in my pockets and they wouldn't be seen. Now, it's a lot easier if you're holding a microphone because it seems like you're able to gesture more naturally if you're talking. But if you don't have a microphone, you're wearing a lavalier mic and you got both hands, you can look pretty stupid. You know, you don't know what to do with your hands. So I think that credibility in the way you present what you're doing, you got to find your formula. Find your formula.
Emma?
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm from Arizona.
Arizona.
Yes. What would you say is the best way to bring like the feelings and emotion of an interview into a written story?
Into a written story.
Yeah.
Okay, good question there too. So I think that a lot of young people have a tendency to write like they think they're supposed to write. I've written a couple of books. I write a magazine column. I enjoy writing, and I think that for what I do, writing is the most important part of what I do. What I see in young writers is there's a great Oscar Wilde, the playwright. There's a great quote from him. He said, "Be yourself, everyone else is taken." And your voice is your voice. Let it be your voice. You know, as long as you don't violate basic rules of grammar so people like this aren't coming after you. Speak in your voice. You know, make it so that it feels like a conversation. I read a great lead the other day in a piece. It was just fabulous because it made me feel like I was just listening to somebody talk. Don't write like you think you're supposed to write. Write in your own voice, you know, the way you would speak. I think there's a lot more latitude for that these days than there used to be. I mean, when I started writing, you know, there were rules, and there are still rules. But you know, some of the great. There was one of the first books that I read, and if you guys haven't read this book, and if it's really a lot of fun, and maybe some of you know this book. Anybody, any of you guys ever read any Hunter Thompson? Okay, again, Howard Cosell and Hunter Thompson.
Homework.
Hunter Thompson, Dr. Hunter S. Thompson, was a man who was responsible for what came to be known as gonzo journalism. He wrote a book called Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And here's the opening line from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. We were somewhere on the outskirts of Barstow when the drugs started to take effect. That's not what you would think would be the opening line in a book that's really good literature or is kind of credible literature. But it was brilliant because what gonzo journalism was, what Hunter Thompson was doing, was basically speaking the way he interacted with people, and he was funny. I don't think you'll be disappointed if you read this book, just because it's kind of kooky, although at this point in your lives, you guys have probably read a lot of stuff like this, but this was groundbreaking back then. And I think it speaks to the whole idea of your voice. You know, this was his voice, and he became one of the most, check me on this, one of the most influential writers of the 20th and 21st centuries. You know, just genius. I mean, an addled brain, crazy, funny, frightening. And he also did a really memorable piece called Fear and Loathing at the Super Bowl, which was his attempt. That might be a better one for you to read. It was his attempt to cover the Super Bowl. And he worked for Rolling Stone magazine. It was a magazine article where he went to cover the Super Bowl. But be you.
Yeah, be you. Don't be afraid to take chances. Along with what Jimmy said, there is a lead that I still remember, and I don't know why I still remember it, aside from that it was phenomenal. There was a guy he worked for ESPN.com, Tommy Tomlinson, who was writing a piece about Jared Lorenzen, who was a quarterback at Kentucky. Jared Lorenzen had always had struggles with his weight, and he was fighting obesity. Tommy Tomlinson, the writer, had the same struggles. And the lead to his story, and I still remember it, which means it was a good lead, was Jared Lorenzen and I are in love with the same woman. Her name is Little Debbie, the snack cakes. And it was,
That's great.
if you were going by journalism as you're told it's supposed to be, you would never think to write it that way. But if it's sitting with me 10 years later, it means it was pretty good.
And understand the style, classic style of writing 100 years ago was kind of stilted, but 75 years ago, there was no such thing as rock and roll music either. 50 years ago, there was no such thing as punk music. 40 years ago, there was no such thing as rap music. We evolve as a culture, and we communicate in different ways. And I just cannot, I love that. It was once violating the cardinal rule. No, this story isn't about you, it's about Jared Lorenzen. But you know what? It gives you perspective when you're reading it. It gives you reason to want to read it.
Yeah.
So,
Who's next? Yeah?
Hi, I'm Samantha. I'm from New
speak
Jersey.
up, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Hi, I'm Samantha. I'm from New Jersey.
Okay.
So I saw right after college you work at the Rockland Westchester newspaper as a staff writer. That's a really big job coming out of college. So my question is, what in college helped you prepare to get a big job like that? And what advice do you have for us, for those that are looking for internships, wanting to go into an entry-level job, or even to connect with others like in the industry?
Okay. Love that question too. So first of all, slight correction, and maybe Wikipedia's got it wrong. I actually had that job in high school. And the only reason I had that job in high school was because my mother was a teacher, and her assistant teacher, her volunteer assistant teacher, who wanted to do something else with her life, happened to be the sports editor of the newspaper. So lesson number one, you all have contacts, use them, okay? That's, I don't want to say the only reason I got that job, but I started as a grunt there and did all the assignments that nobody else wanted to do, but I was really fortunate, okay? Here's the best thing I can tell you about trying to get a job, okay? Because I know that's on a lot of your minds. Don't go and ask somebody for a job. Ask them for their advice, okay? So what's that going to do? Well, first of all, if you go and ask somebody for a job, they may not have a job to give you. They may not want to give you a job. There are a million reasons why that might not work, and they may be put in an uncomfortable position. But if you go to somebody and you ask them for their advice, two things are going to happen. The first thing is, if you're listening, you're going to get the perspective of somebody who's kind of walked that path before you. And if you keep your ears open, you'll learn something. But the second thing, which I think is actually, in a practical sense, more important, if you ask somebody for their advice, you're going to flatter them. And this is a little devious. It's not disingenuous, but you're going to flatter them. And that person now may look on this interaction a little bit differently. And they may think, oh, I like this person. I want to do whatever I can to help her. And they're not necessarily uncomfortable. You've made an ally. So I cannot tell you how much I believe. This is just my personal feeling, okay? Don't go to people and ask them for jobs. Go to people and ask them for advice. And when they give you their advice, maybe somewhere in there is going to be another name that's mentioned. I went and saw there was a fellow at KTXO. He's still there, he's a news director, and he's great. Or he was the editor at the Missouri Sentinel, and he's great, and he's still there. Hey, I wonder if you wouldn't mind passing along his contact information. I'd love to find out, how he got started. Somewhere along the line, build relationships, network. It's really, really important, especially these days where there are a million no's for every one yes. I'll give you an example. So I live in Westchester County down here, about an hour south of here, a little bit more. Got a phone call yesterday from, my wife and I are very friendly with another couple in town. They have 3 boys, we have 3 boys. I've known their kids literally since the day they arrived on planet Earth. Their oldest boy called me yesterday, graduated from the University of Alabama, and wants to be involved in some aspect of sports, whether it's commerce or journalism. He applied for a job at NBC, a job that was posted. He was told there were 980 applications for that job. So what are you going to do to differentiate yourself? You know, and I will say this, there's always going to be somebody who's got more impressive credentials than you. There's always been somebody who has had more impressive credentials than me, by a lot, okay? So create relationships, make yourself memorable, ask for advice, make that person an ally, you know, so that when that interview is over, that person takes your resume and puts it to the side and it's like, I got to remember to call her. This might work for her. I hope that is helpful. It's what I believe. You know, it may not necessarily be the answer, but it's what I believe.
Justin?
Hi, I'm Justin. I'm from Connecticut.
Okay.
So you're talking about advice. Well, I'd like some advice from you.
Okay.
What tips would you give aspiring journalists to conduct the best interview possible?
Okay. So, Justin, we've covered a little bit of this, but I really think that it's listen. You got to listen. Mm-hmm. You know, there may be a couple of bullet points that you have, but the best interviews are ones that start with only one prepared question, and everything else moves from there. It's a conversation. I think, again, I'm really, really big on being able to look at yourself in the mirror, and there may be a cost from it, you know. I went through a lot of years where I was persona non grata with Tiger Woods. But that was okay with me because I had been fair to him and true to me. And I think it may be hard to see that, but I think listen. 4 things. Listen, work hard, be organized, and be prepared. I think to boil it down, that's a pretty good checklist. But I mean, take each one of those things seriously. You know, don't ever go into an interview thinking you can wing it. You know, it's just not a good idea. And be organized because it'll help make you feel as if you've got command over what you need to do. The hardest workers are the most accomplished people, I think. I'll give you one quick example about hard work and organization. So Mike Tirico, who obviously you all know, is a really good guy. He's very talented, but he's an extraordinarily hard worker. So whenever we go do an event, and I've noticed this, when he does a golf event, he has his own spotting sheet. He doesn't have a staff member make it up for him. He does research and creates. He has a template that's on his laptop that he creates. It's basically an information cheat sheet. And it takes a lot of time to do that, but he does it. And that's hard work, organization, and he's prepared, you know. And you combine that with talent, it's pretty deadly.
Let's try to get a couple more in really quick. Jack?
Hi, my name is Jack. I'm from Denver, Colorado. And I know you've mentioned being organized a couple times. I don't tend to consider myself the most organized person in the world, so I'm wondering what tips you have to stay organized.
Jack, as they say, I feel you. I am ADD. I'm as ADD as they come, and so for me, it's a defense. It's my lifeline. Jack, what is it that you see yourself doing? Are you as a broadcaster, as a written journalist? Tell me.
So I'm really into photojournalism,
Ah.
but I also like long form narrative written stuff.
Yeah, I can't really tell you other than whatever you need to do to feel like you can't be surprised, that's organization. So for me, I struggled initially when I first started doing some studio work. And again, it's another thing I had never done before, and I was not very good at it. And I'd like to think I became really good at it, or at least very comfortable at it. One of the things that I learned, never trust the teleprompter. Never trust the teleprompter. You know what? They work a lot better now than they used to, but never trust the teleprompter. So what I do to this day, when I'm in the studio, I insist in every commercial, I have them print for me the page, anything that's in the teleprompter, I get a printout of, and they are numbered on the front and the back. And I keep up turning the pages with the copy that's going by, so that if I'm 5 pages in on the prompter and I have them make a mark on it, I know that I'm 5 pages in. You know what that does for me? It provides me a level of comfort, because I know that if the teleprompter goes down, I got something in front of me. I know if I start to ad-lib, I can just pick it up where I was. I know where I am. Listen, we at it, well, not at NBC. This is my saying, and a buddy of mine. If somebody says, I'll give you the best. Another great comment from Chris Berman. Chris Berman, I remember being with him after some aspect of some broadcast kind of did not go well. And I think somebody said to him, "Boomer, are you okay?" And he said, "Yeah, what we just did right now, it's at Pluto." The point is, the whole, first of all, move on, okay? Do whatever you can do to provide yourself some comfort and security. Being organized, okay, I was organized with my pages. And at some point, something's going to go wrong. I mean, if you're doing broadcast television, shit happens. It often does. And I was once doing, one of the things I used to do during golf telecasts, we would do these sponsored sports updates where they'd come to me and I'd give the scores of the latest, the biggest, current sporting events. And, it was about a 3 or 4 minute segment in the middle of a network broadcast. And we were doing one up here in Massachusetts. And in the commercial before the segment, we lost power in all the monitor wall. So now I was narrating like a 4-minute highlight package that I couldn't see. And the way I was doing it was kind of cutting out half the words and relying on my producer, who was saying, "Okay, next video, next video." And we were organized. So it gave me comfort. Comfort, gives you confidence. A lot of being a broadcaster is confidence. You have to feel like, so what that the monitor wall went down? Confidence, really important. How do you get confidence? Work hard, be organized, be prepared. I mean, I can't tell you in terms of the specific pieces of advice for what you do. Whatever you need to do, just be organized and be prepared, and you'll be undefeated. I really believe it.
Time for one more. Who's going to close us out? I guess we're going to do 3 quick ones. Let's go back here first. I'll ignore Pete.
Hi, my name is Alyssa. I'm from Massachusetts. You mentioned that you spent time early in your career as a runner and a production assistant. That's probably where a lot of us are going to start out. I want to know, what's something that you learned just from observing other people do the work that you wanted to be doing?
Okay, so first of all, I don't care how old any of you are. You have no idea what you're going to end up doing, okay? So the only thing that's important is what you are doing. And so pour yourself into it. here's one word that you should never use within reason. No. You know, the whole idea of what you're doing at an entry level is to kind of distinguish yourself. And so short of somebody asking you to do something which is inappropriate, you know, the answer is yeah, okay, sure. How can I help? Tuck that one away. How can I help? It's really, really important, because job one for you guys is all to distinguish yourselves so that you get an opportunity to move on. Keep your eyes and ears open. You know, you're going to learn, I think, in that first job, whatever job it is. You may find out that, oh, I guess I don't want to do this, but I do want to do that. Just pay attention, you know? And when you find that person who's doing what you want to do, introduce yourself and say, hey, do you have 10 minutes? I'm really curious about something. I wonder if you wouldn't mind helping me understand something. I think that's really a good strategy, okay? And you know what? If they say no, they're a tool, so.
Let's go with Joe and Andrew, and we have to close with Andrew. It's only fitting.
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm from Stratford, Connecticut.
Okay.
You touched on it a little bit throughout the whole process today, but I was just curious about you specifically, really. When it comes to doing tough interviews with people, real tough subjects, have you ever had to consider your relationship with that person beforehand when framing your questions?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a story about what separated Tiger and myself. So I had worked at ESPN for 12 years. I had a really good relationship with Tiger. I got hired by NBC, and my first event for NBC was the 2000 US Open at Pebble Beach. Tiger had that, so we were on the air Saturday, and Tiger had hit his drive on 18. We were on the air early because there had been some weather delays, so we were on the air on the East Coast very early, which in time that was normally reserved for children's viewing. Tiger hits a ball into the water and curses up a blue streak, gets caught on camera, and you know, it's a terribly uncomfortable situation. But also, earlier that week, Tiger had chosen not to go to a memorial service for a golfer named Payne Stewart, who had been killed in a plane crash in 1999. He was a very popular player, won 3 major championships, very emotional. They did a big celebration of his life on the 18th hole at Pebble Beach. Everybody hit balls into the water. Tiger chose not to go to that. You should never tell people what you're going to ask. They don't have the right to know that. But I felt it wasn't right to ambush him. You know, he would think that he was coming up to the tower to talk about all the great shots that he hit. So I went down off the tower, and after he was about to come in and we met privately for a second, I said, look, I just want you to know that the cameras picked you up cursing out there on the golf course. And I really think we got to talk about that. And that's all I said to him. Because I felt that was the right thing to do. I didn't feel, first of all, I didn't feel like if I did ambush him with it, I didn't think he was going to have a coherent answer. And I just felt it was the right thing to do. I didn't tell him about the Payne Stewart thing. He came up into the booth. I asked him about that. I asked him about the Payne Stewart interview and about the Payne Stewart ceremony. And he was angry. He answered the questions. I don't remember exactly what he said, but he walked away. And that really, really was the beginning of the end of our relationship, or the relationship that we had. So yeah, I thought about it, But again, for me, it was looking in the mirror and thinking what was right. You know, that was right. That was fair to him. True to me. Yeah, you know, I'm sure there have been plenty of difficult questions I've had to ask over the years, but I think that with experience, I've kind of learned how to ask those difficult questions, and I'm sure you will too. You know, as long as you can be fair to your interview subject and true to yourself. I'm sorry, it's hard for me to kind of give you a prescription. The best thing, you know, it's the Callahan line, you know. Is it fair, you know, and is it true to you?
Andrew, behind you for the last one.
Andrew, I got high expectations for this because you're the anchor man on the relay.
I'm Andrew. I'm from Massachusetts. I'd say, you know, over your career, what would you say is kind of the evolution of the journalism field, and where do you kind of see it going in the future with, you know, technology changing and just everything changing?
Well, the great thing for you guys is that when I got involved, listen, when I started in the business, there was no ESPN, there was no Fox network, there was ABC, CBS, and NBC. That was it for national broadcasting. When I first started with ABC, you know, if we were going to produce a feature story, we would do it in a room, in an edit room that was as big as that whole area in back of you guys. Now, you can shoot with this, you can edit with your laptop. You know, the barriers to entry have totally disappeared. You know, if you can get online, which everybody can, you've got the tools to be a journalist, to be a storyteller. That's the good news for you guys. And I think that it's great that if what you do is worthy or interesting, it'll find its way out there. Look, how many people, you guys probably know, people on YouTube, you know, people who have YouTube channels who are making, you know, bazillions of dollars, and they're doing it just because they, you know, they don't have some big infrastructure behind them. They're, you know, just telling stories or doing content, right? That's the really great news for you guys. I think that conventional media is shrinking. So I think more than ever, it's really important that people like you guys rely on your own personal North Star when it comes to integrity, because, you know, there's very little oversight left anymore. And the only oversight comes from yourself. So I think it's good news for you guys because, like I said, the barriers to entry, they don't exist any longer, but the responsibility for all of you is even greater, because now it's on you. It's totally on you, because nobody's going to say, take that offline, or if they are, you can just block them, right? So that's the good news, Andrew.
Jimmy, thank you very much for doing this,
Nick,
for
my
coming
pleasure.
along for the ride on the maiden voyage of What's Your Story. I appreciate your time, and thank you for doing this.
Nick,
Jimmy
it's good to be
Roberts.
with you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Sure.